Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Welcome to Fish University. I've been working in ponds and small impoundments and lakes all over the southern states and to a lesser degree in the cooler climates. Most of my clients have the typical largemouth bass, bluegill communities in their ponds and lakes, and usually their lakes are relatively shallow and productive. Bass are the principal target species, and although a few are managing more for brim, most of them target bass. Often these lakes focus on a single target species, either the bass or the bluegill, but today we're going to take an in-depth look at a lake that was designed and stocked with multiple species in mind. Lake Deanna on the Dolce Vita Ranch in Missouri is the result of Greg Graves' vision to create a multi-predator system. But it's a work in progress. My guests today are Mr. Graves and the pond boss himself, Mr. Bob Lusk, who has been consulting in the management of this unique system. So, gentlemen, how are you doing today?
Good, Wes. Thank you for having us.
Bob's over there giving me the thumbs up.
I tell people I'm still leading a pretty cool life, which is the truth.
Bob, you've been in the pond management business for a long time. Tell us a little bit about how you got into fisheries management, what you do, and your background and experience.
When I was 14 years old, my parents bought a place on the Brazos River, southwest of Fort Worth, Texas, where I grew up, and spent almost every weekend out there. And I couldn't wait to get the groceries unloaded, and then I was going to the river. And it was just a great way to spend weekends. And I came in long enough to eat and sleep, and then I'd be back out in the river. And I made up my mind when I was 14 years old, I wanted to make a living messing with fish somehow. I didn't know what it looked like, what it smelled like. I knew kind of what it smelled like. I didn't know what it was going to be like, And so I ended up getting a degree in fisheries management from Texas A&M in December of 1979. And then I started into at least a fish farm for a while. Then that was the same year in 1980 that the state of Texas stopped giving away free fish to stock ponds and lakes, so people had to buy them. And there was no pond management industry at all back then, so I got to help carve out a niche and then started really getting into the pond management part about 1983, and it's just been a fun ride since then. I've tried to figure out how to scratch out a living, selling fish to stock ponds and then managing ponds. And then in 1992, Pond Boss magazine was born, and it's in its 32nd year of publication. So I manage that now. So then I started building a pond management company, and the pond management industry started to develop, and I got to help do some of that. And so here we are, fast forward 45 years, and I got a lot in the rearview mirror and still a little bit in the headlights.
And Bob, you have the distinction of being the first repeat guest on my podcast with today's episode.
All right, here we go.
And Greg, you and your property are the main character in this podcast. How about you give us your background, where you come from, and then let's start into a history of the lake and tell us a little bit about the initial development and your vision.
You bet. I live by the creed that if you're friends with the pond boss, your life has got to be pretty good.
Check that out.
So I am friends with the pond boss. You can tell I've had this app for a while by how dirty it is. Deanna and I have been married since 1979. We're both one generation out of the farm. I'm actually both sides one generation off the farm. My dad was a World War II tail gunner, And Deanna's heritage, she, on one side, one generation off the chicken farm. On the other side, one generation off from being a gold miner in the Black Hills of South Dakota. So we both grew up not wondering where our next meal was, but certainly on the lower side of the income scale. And while we both grew up very happy family members, moving to Kansas City, which is where we moved in 1980 for a couple of rural South Dakota kids, felt like we were moving to Singapore. 38 years later, my engineering degree and a little hard work and a little blessings from above, my career just blossomed. And I ended up for 13 years being the CEO and the chairman of the board of America's ninth biggest engineering and construction company. That meant an early retirement, writing books about employee ownership, raising money for civic causes, and getting to create things, which is what Deanna and I really love. And so, being a couple of rural kids from South Dakota, we immediately started looking for a large piece of property anywhere close to Kansas City, and we're lucky enough to find what we now call the La Dolce Vita Ranch, which stands for To the Sweet Life, an Italian toast of wine, which Bob knows is another favorite of ours. We've bought 700 acres here in central Missouri, about 45 minutes southeast of Kansas City. And that area of Missouri is, while it doesn't feel like you're there, geologically, you're already in the Ozarks. So it's heavy limestone, it's heavily rolling hills. And when you get out the topographical maps, you get real excited if you like fish. And in 2014, when we were first looking at this property, we got out the topographical maps and we found a spot where we could build a very large body of water. Now, for 2 years, we spent trying to buy that property and trying to convince the Corps of Engineers that this was a good idea. That's not always a simple or cheap thing to accomplish, but we did get that accomplished. And in 2016, the La Dolce Vita Ranch was born. Engineering companies and construction companies were hired, and we built what basically Bob and I felt was the largest body of water we could fit onto this property. We're right up against a primary stream on one side, and we basically fill it to the culvert to the roads to the west. The engineering piece, the construction pieces, those were things that I'm good at and that I really love. And so all of that I understood exceptionally well and was able to hire some of the best local companies to get that accomplished. What I didn't know exceptionally well was what's going to happen under the water. But I knew I only had one chance. And so I investigated all across America, pond management, lake fishery management folks. And one of the magazines that I had subscribed to over those couple of years, of course, was the Pond Boss magazine, in addition to others. And you know, there's just something about Bob. Bob's just not in it because it's a good business for him. He absolutely loves it. And so the first time I met Bob Lusk, the lake was empty. Construction had just begun. One thing I knew well enough was I'm a planner, and I knew I was only going to get to plan this thing once. And we were going to get a heavy rain one day, and then the planning was going to be over. And so when Bob came, the construction had really just begun. And he got out of his pickup truck with his sandals on and waded through the poison ivy and the poison oak and down in the crevices of where this lake was going to be. And oh my God, did my fun begin right then and there.
And so, Bob, you've been involved with this project since pretty much the onset. Tell us about what you did to help establish habitat within the lake and the initial stocking and how you decided to go with species that we don't typically think about all together in a small impoundment.
Well, this lake, guys, is about 65 acres, so it's really a nice sized lake. And actually, the first time I came was in October of 2016, and Greg was in the final throes of getting his permit, and they'd done a little bit of clearing and were getting ready to start building the dam. And so one thing that we suggested was to see if we could flag the water line, and because I like to see where the water line is going to be, so then we can start to decide what we're going to do below the water line and what we're going to do above the water line. Find out where the shallow areas are going to be. And he had one cove that was only going to be about 2 feet deep. It was pretty much almost like a bedrock, solid rock bottom. And, you know, when I start looking at a habitat plan, I love to see what nature has to offer. And on the south side of that lake, where the dump trucks were going to build a road, there was a pretty sharp drop. I mean, it was a 45-degree drop down to a sheer drop going down into the little tributary. Now, they built the dam right next to a bigger tributary and blocked a small creek that was going to abut the big creeks. They couldn't disrupt the big creek. And the watershed was certainly big enough, so then we started designing the habitat. And with all the rock in place, rock is my absolute number one favorite element of fish habitat. And Greg is blessed with a lot of that karst limestone looking stuff. And then he had a bunch of trees down in the basin. So we decided to set back some of the trees and then use the rock the best we could. And then I was puzzled about that one shallow cove that was going to be a focal point, because at that point I was planning to put a small cabin on that cove, and I knew it would be choked with plants. So we had a bunch of heavy equipment out there, and one of the pieces of equipment was a track hoe with a hammer on it, where they had hammered out the core trench to build the dam, and they broke up a bunch of that rock and used off-road dump trucks to make big rock piles down in water that's going to be 12 to 15 feet deep. And part of the mission, when Greg and I sat down at the very beginning in October of 2016, he said, I'd really like to grow some big largemouth bass, maybe even a state record if we can. I'd like to grow some walleye and smallmouth bass. So part of the habitat plan was to do everything we could to create the best habitat for those three target species of fish. And that's what we did. And what was really fun was, it's like the lake was a wedding cake and we got to decorate it. All the decoration stuff came toward the end, which was the big rock piles and spawning beds. He put a bunch of spawning beds out there. He even created one area where it was fairly shallow, built a retaining wall and backfilled it so that he'd have a place to fly fish off of. So not only did we look at the habitat for the fish, we looked at how do we design it to enjoy the lake. So he knew he'd want to be fishing from the shore some, so we created some shoreline habitat, and then he loves to drift fish for walleye, so the rock piles come in handy for that. He can drift a crankbait or whatever he wants to fish with over the tops of some of these rock piles and catch his walleye. So then the lake construction was actually finished in 2017, and then in the spring of 2018, we stocked bluegills, fathead minnows, and we stocked red ear. We stocked those at a much higher than normally recommended rate. We stocked them at bluegill about 2,000 per acre, because one of the missions was to grow some trophy bass, which is happening. And then in the fall of 2018, we added walleye and smallmouth bass, and we left it like that. And he set up some feeders in I think the spring of 2019, started really feeding the fish well, and we added the largemouth bass. I think it was July of 2019, we added largemouth bass. And then we did a second stocking of walleye in November of 2020. Now it's into the management phase, and the lake's producing really, really well. And Wes, you've been there, you can talk about some of the bass that have been caught, but it's reached that tipping point where it's time to start harvesting some fish. So that's where we are right now. And, when we were there in the fall, I think there were 2 bass that were weighed that were over 8 pounds, and that was 2023. So that was 5 years? No, 4 years. 4 years. Yeah, 4 years bass, in, 8-pound bass in northwest Missouri, north central Missouri. That's pretty good.
And you mentioned the rock piles that you put out there in the deeper water. This is a fairly deep lake. Down here in the south, a typical lake, we may shoot for a mean depth of 6 foot deep with a maximum depth of maybe 12 or 14 foot deep. This lake goes to 35, 40 feet deep in the deepest part?
Actually, the deepest point in the lake is 62 feet deep. The ephemeral streams that ran through our property that fill the lake up when it rains, they were averaging between 50 and 20 feet deep. And Bob, I'd say 20, 30 feet wide. And so Bob's idea was to just run along that stream bed where the walleyes were just going to love all those changes in topography, and put occasional rock piles. And you don't need to know where they are. You just know where the walleye are hitting. And so we have lots of changes of topography all around the lake.
So Bob, you've been following this lake for a while. We've built it. You've put in all this habitat, brush piles, rock piles. Well, also, we didn't mention there's also feeders on the lake.
4.
So 4 feeding stations on the lake that are feeding the bluegill. Pretty nice bluegill. And one of the things, you've been sampling this lake since its onset and following the growth rates of fish. And one of the things we noticed when we were up there, you mentioned the 8-pound bass that were caught while we were there. You've never electrofished an 8-pound bass out there, right?
No, I tell you what we have done though, when we were, I guess, 2 years in, the first time we electrofished, 2 years in with the bass. So this had to be 2021. We shocked up 2 bass that were knocking on the door of 5 pounds after 2 years. And oh my gosh, I had to sit down. My legs were shaking. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Greg said earlier how much I love it. When people ask me how I'm doing, I'll tell people I'm still leading a pretty cool life, which is absolutely true. And I do love it. I tried to quit 2 or 3 times, but there's this little fire inside of me that just won't go out. And when I see a fish like that, that's got the depth and the breadth and the short length and the weight, and it's not a 2-pound gizzard shad hanging out of its throat, to get that weight, I get really excited. I know the odds of a bass getting to be almost 5 pounds in western Missouri in 2 years. And I think we have greater odds to get struck by lightning than a bass has to get that big. So when I see that, I get really excited because now I know that there's propensity and the opportunity with the new lake syndrome, by the way, which is part of the reason those fish are getting so big, because we knew the numbers we stocked in the beginning. And to know that there's that percentage of them that are actually performing to that level, I know he's going to have some bass that are well above 10 pounds, and he's not far from it,
Yeah.
So even though we haven't shocked up an 8-pound bass, there was some, you and Bruce Condello caught them on a rod and reel. So I know they're there, but they're not easy to shock. What's easy to shock is what's shallow, and which is those, carbon copy fish that need to be starting to need to be called out and harvested.
That's exactly where I was going with that, is that sometimes we don't see the biggest fish when we electrofish. So angling is really important, especially angling with some strategy, because, Bruce Condello, and I'm hoping to have Bruce on here to talk about one of his lakes here in the near future. Bruce got this idea. He says, if I was a big bass, I wouldn't be roaming the vegetation looking for a hard to catch meal. I'd be hanging out in front of that feeder. And Bruce went down there and he caught some bluegill. And he figured those bass are hanging out in front of the feeder, waiting for the bluegill to feed, and then just feeding on bluegill. So he caught some small bluegill, put them on a hook, and tossed them out there. I forget what he caught, like 2 or 3 bass that were in the 8-pound range, and lost 2 or 3 more.
Yes.
Pretty quickly when we failed to catch them with electrofishing just earlier that day.
That's right.
So, Wes, when Bob and you came last fall and you brought Bruce and others, Bob told me that there were some guys coming who were really good at fishing. And I thought, yeah, okay, well, I'm pretty good at fishing too, so we'll see what happens. And we all had dinner that night and had a couple of drinks. And the next morning I wake up and I see somebody who I don't know if I'd met before the night before walking down my rock wall. And I got real excited. I got dressed in a hurry. And as I got down to him, by 8 o'clock in the morning, he had broken the lake record. So that's a guy who knows how to fish.
That's what he does.
So that was fun. And then I said, okay, stop. My turn. Show me what you did. And by 9 o'clock, I had broken his lake record. So it's one thing to have the fish out there, and it's one thing to have fished your whole life and just, to be good at it. But it's another thing to be great at it and to really understand where the fish might be. And while I thought that might be a story about seeing 6 feet long catfish, a guy that can just feel the fish, Bruce, he can feel the fish.
He sure can. Nobody better at him than that.
So when you think you need to have someone come and shock your lake to tell you what's in it, just keep in mind that you can usually do that with a rod and reel. Now, big fish will shock just fine, but it may not be in the right depth of water to shock.
I will say, Wes, for your viewers, if they have never electric shocked their ponds before or brought in an expert like Bob or Bruce or someone like that to survey their ponds, if they have a pond that's big enough to get a boat on, and I'm not sure how big that is, Bob, probably not very big, but if you have a pond big enough just to get one of these electric shock boats on, you will never have had so much fun in your entire life than to see these big fish come up and hopefully have your children or grandchildren on the nets, hauling them into the boat. It's important. It's educational. We learn from it. We adapted from the information, but it's also the funnest thing I do every year.
As an angler, it'll humble you because you're like, I fish that tree all the time and I barely ever catch a fish off of it. And then Bob pulls up with his electrofishing boat and 50 bass roll up in 30 seconds. Bob, you mentioned the fast growth rates on the largemouth bass, but we're not exactly seeing that with the other two predator species, right? I think the smallmouth bass, they're growing okay, but they're not reaching numbers that you might want in the lake. But the walleye, if I recall, they were quite thin. They don't seem to be taking to the lake the way the bass did.
They did great early. And then once the largemouth bass started to hit about 8 to 10 inches, the competition got pretty fierce. And so now the food chain's a little bit upside down, and some of those better walleye have actually lost some weight. The solution is going to be to thin out the primary predator, which is largemouth bass, and look at supplemental stocking of some more forage fish. Like we've added golden shiners a couple of times. One time we put like 1,200 pounds of golden shiners in that lake, and the walleye wear them out. Because when we did our electrofishing survey back in October when we were all together, we didn't shock up a single solitary golden shiner anywhere. And 1,200 pounds they're like 6 pounds per thousand. So that's a high 6-figure number of
200,000 is what I came up with.
that's about right. So 200,000 golden shiners in a 65-acre lake. Where'd they go? Well, they got eaten. So that's another sure sign that the predators are a little heavy. And on the smallmouth, I really hope they would reproduce. I didn't expect that they would. I knew the walleye wouldn't. They can't. They don't have the elements they need there. But I hope the smallmouth might get a shot at it, but they're not, because there's enough large bluegills and nest raiders and nest competition that smallmouth aren't going to be able to reproduce very well at all. So in order to have more smallmouth bass, we need to stock more smallmouth bass. But I'm not going to recommend that till we get the largemouth bass culled down and get the numbers. Here's something about this lake that's exciting to me as well as interesting. First of all, Greg is all in. This has been a lifelong dream for him to do this, and he's got the ability to do it. So it's, okay, now we got it. Now what do we do next? And how do we keep it going? And, keep that growth curve like this. Don't let it hit here too long. So these intermediate sized bass are right here. The big bass are not. They've got all the food they can eat. They can eat a 10-inch bass or a 12-inch bass. So those big bass, they can eat those 5-inch bluegills. So those 8-pound bass, 6, 7, 8-pound bass, probably some 9-pounders now, have got all they need. So what we got to do is figure out what to do to take care of those smaller ones. And the number one thing is to cull. So when we left last October, I got on the phone and called one of my buddies at Bass Pro Shops, Dan Hoy, who runs he's in charge of all facilities. He's the guy that started the aquarium program for Bass Pro Shops. I said, hey, we got a lake not far from you that we need to be culling some bass. So he and I have had several conversations, and there's a university nearby that would like to come and meet up and help cull some of those bass. And if Bass Pro Shops can use some of them, they will. But you turn it into more of an educational opportunity for some college fisheries classes there in Missouri. And so kind of kill a whole bunch of birds with one stone. Maybe we've even talked about having bringing the Boy Scouts out or something to help cull. But the most exciting thing about this culling program is it can be exclusively selective. So we can be culling these fish with electrofishing and hand pick the ones that need to come out of the lake, which means we can cull males, we can cull underperforming fish, because we pretty much know the ages without spending a lot of time trying to figure it out. So we're going to be able to have the best of both worlds here in another 6 or 8 weeks or so and start culling some of these fish and do it with some science-based selective harvesting.
And you mentioned science-based selective harvesting. What would you recommend? How many pounds per acre are you thinking to take out of this lake per year?
Well, I'd start with about 20 pounds per acre, but I'd be real picky. I'd want fish that are, say, under 92 relative weights to be the first ones to be culled. And if we're rocking long shocking, we shock up a 12-inch bass that weighs 15 ounces, it's going back in the lake. What do we shock up a 12-inch bass that weighs 10 ounces, it's going to go the way of the fillet knife, where it's coming out. So cherry picking those fish individually, I think, is going to be real important.
Yeah, and one of the things that I like to tell people is, when you remove fish is very important. Going out there right now and just taking out all your fish in the early spring, the bass are just going to respond and recruit a lot more. Whereas if you put a lot of that harvest towards the fall, the recruitment gets set about midsummer. They spawn in the spring. By the time they get 2 or 3 inches, most of them have been eaten by other fish. Once that recruitment's set, if you start taking fish out in the fall, that'll help to prevent new fish from taking their place. So it's a good idea to spread out the harvest and focus a lot of it later in the year once recruitment's been set.
Here's what's daunting from the owner's viewpoint on that, Wes, and that Bob and I have discussed a lot. If you take a 65-acre lake and you want to take out 20 pounds of bass per acre, and the average bass is a pound, that's 1,300 fish that got to come out. Well, I'm pretty good at fishing, but I'm not that good, and neither are my kids or grandkids. That is a lot of fish, right? It's half a ton of bass that have to come out. And so you can't just look at it as, I'm going to look at every bass I catch and decide whether to eat it or throw back. You need an engineer's approach to how you're going to accomplish this. And there's lots of fun ideas, and Bob's had at least 2 great ones already. But it probably comes down to hiring the right company to come in and do it at the right time, like you said, and making sure that the right fish come out.
Yes, and here's the way I see this. We overstocked that lake in the beginning with the food chain. We stocked it about like it should have been with the walleye and the smallmouth, but we overstocked it with largemouth bass a year later. And we did that, and I'll tell you exactly why we did this. This may make sense. We stocked it, and then there's going to be some people that are going to say, what? We stocked largemouth bass at 200 per acre fingerlings. They were about, 3 inches long when we stocked it. And I did that on purpose. And the reason was I knew that half of those would be boys and half of them would be girls. So in a 65-acre lake, we actually stocked 12,000 bass, knowing that half of those are boys and they're not going to grow very well anyway, and the other half are girls. That was 6,000 girls. And what we'd hoped is that at least 30% of those, which is 1,800, would have the genetic propensity, as well as having enough food to eat and the opportunity to grow really, really big. And that's what's happening. So we knew we were going to have to be culling fish probably after the second year or the third year. And here we are, we're 3 years after the bass now. We're going into the 4th year after the bass were stocked. We knew we needed to cull some, but the whole mission was to have a big enough percentage of female bass have the opportunity to be able to thrive and get huge in that lake. Now, I don't know if we got that many, but I know there's a bunch of them, and I know they're coming up really, really well, and I know it's time to be culling. And also, one thing I think will happen, and to your point a while ago, Wes, is that the fish are, when you start culling bass in the spring, nature's way is to fill that void. So they're going to recruit well. But the catch-22 for those poor little bass is now there's even more bass that are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pounds coming up that pipeline that are only 4 years old. Culling some of these bass would be helpful, and let them recruit, because that becomes even more food for those bigger bass. One of the obstacles is, how do we keep feeding the bigger bass, make sure they don't run out of food, but we don't stop recruitment from helping bring more fish up into the junior varsity. And that's where that selective harvesting comes in. And Greg's right. I mean, you want to have a lake and have fun with it, but when you start thinking about, oh my gosh, I got to harvest 1,300 pounds over the course of 6 months, then it turns into a job, and that's work. And that's where a lot of people mess up. They don't really think about that.
Well, Greg's welcome to invite us back up this fall to help remove fish. We didn't mention the genetic strain of bass. What did you stock? Is it northern fish or is it F1 hybrids? What are you having there?
We did whatever Missouri will let us do. So we mixed the genetics the best we could to stay within the bounds of the laws of the state of Missouri. So there were a couple of different strains. And I tell you what, people think that northern strain bass can't get to double digits. Well, yes, they can if they've got the opportunity. Most of them top out at 6 or 8 pounds because they don't have that opportunity. So we tried to find some genetics that suited that region, and that's what we did.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Fish University. Do you have a question or a topic for the podcast? If so, you can email me at Wes, that's W-E-S, .Neal, that's N-E-A-L, at Mississippi State, that's M-S-S-T-A-T-E, .edu. Or instead, please visit the Fish University Facebook page. On the Facebook page, you will find useful articles, videos, stories, and other information, as well as updates on upcoming podcasts. Not to mention, you can send me a private message with questions or suggestions. Just search Fish University and look for our colorful logo. And please follow the Fish University page. We need your support. Now back to the show.
There's something else going on in the lake that's affecting the ability of the bass and the other species to feed, and that is aquatic vegetation. What species are growing in the lake?
There's bushy pondweed and some American pondweed. Now, one thing we didn't mention earlier in the show is the upper reaches of this lake. We didn't do anything with it, and there's probably 8 acres up there where the water comes in under the culvert, under the road, that is all topsoil, fairly shallow. We left alone. We did that on purpose. We wanted that to be a natural filter. We also wanted it to be a nursery ground for forage fish. And so there's a lot of that water up there that's not 2 feet deep. Matter of fact, you'd have to have a shallow draft boat to get all the way to the upper end of that lake, but we did that on purpose so we could have that. Now, there's one stretch along the retaining wall. And by the way, the retaining walls, what's really cool is the majority of the rock that Greg built the retaining walls, he's got a very cool rock dock. All that rock came out of the bottom of that lake where they built the core trench, where they had to hammer that rock out. So he built a long retaining wall, and in water about 4 feet deep, when the lake is full, we built a shelf and just lined it with gravel, making spawning beds. And some of that area gets choked up with bushy pondweed. And then there's a cove across the lake where there's quite a bit of bushy pondweed and some American pondweed that's growing. I don't think there's too much aquatic plants. I just think some of it's in the wrong spot.
What happens too, and I recall when we were electrofishing, that's habitat for the small bluegill, the small bass to hide in. And even though you've got a bunch of hungry bass out there, they can't get to the prey because the prey could tuck into this vegetation. And I remember going through one of those points just west of the house where the pondweed was topping up, and it was just choked full of tiny little bluegill that nobody could eat because they couldn't get to them. So there may be prey available for the bass, but the bass can't get to the prey because there's too much structure. My advice would be to actually reduce the amount of vegetation out there to free up the prey so that the bass can catch it.
In my perspective, I don't disagree with that at all. My perspective in western Missouri like that is that pondweed is going to die back, and then the prey get released. So I'm totally on board with treating some of those weed mats, especially where it's invasive in areas that you don't want it, which to me, what that means is you can't fish it, or it's close to the shore or whatever. But in some of those areas where nobody goes, I just soon leave it alone and let nature do what nature does. And then those bluegill are a little bit bigger when those plants die back in November. And then here comes more bluegills going into the winter.
But let's change gears a little bit and talk about the walleye, because one of the things that struck me when we were electrofishing was the walleye never seemed to be where I expected the walleye to be.
Yeah, same here. That lake, and you know what? I've worked on a number of lakes with walleye, and they are so unpredictably predictable. Like you wouldn't think in October that you'd be shocking walleye in water a foot deep. but they sure are there. I mean, they come up in those, and actually that cove where he knocked all the rock out and made it deeper. I've shocked more walleye in that cove than anywhere else in the lake. And sometimes we electrofish in June, sometimes in May, and then, this is the first time we did it in October. But they were in really shallow water. But you know what? Greg can tell you when he catches them.
I like eating bass, but I love eating walleye. And so, you remember that Dan and I are a couple of South Dakota kids, and so we grew up fishing for walleyes and northerns and stuff like that in the northern U.S. So one of the things I was so thrilled about this property was that we had deep enough water where the walleyes maybe couldn't populate, but they certainly could survive and hopefully successfully. The biggest walleye we've caught in the history of this lake, we caught 3 years ago. And so there's the problem. We caught an over 3-pound walleye, but I want to catch a 6 or 8-pound walleye now. And there might be one out there in that deep rock structure, but I haven't been able to get it to bite. And so my real issue is that we talk about all this bluegills and sunfish being caught up on shore. The bass are hitting them so hard, they just never get out to or down to the walleyes. And so they're just not growing like I want them to grow, or we're not shocking them up. But even the ones we do shock up are skinny, Bob. And so we really have to reduce the number of competitors, I guess.
That's it. That's exactly right. I think we reduce the number of competitors. We may look at stocking some golden shiners again, because, my hope would be with that much pondweed in, that's the substrate golden shiners need to be able to spawn. And so my hope had been that we could establish a breeding population of golden shiners, which usually isn't that hard, but in this lake, it hasn't happened yet. So we're going to talk about that later.
I'm sure some of the northern listeners are probably screaming at the monitors right now as they listen to the podcast because, bass are to bluegill as walleye are to yellow perch.
Yes.
So have you thought about putting yellow perch out there as a walleye forage?
I have, but I haven't thought about it deeply enough. I really need to dig into that a little bit more because that sure could be a good answer. The reason I'm hesitate right now is because I haven't come to peace with how they'd survive with that many predators now. If we were going to do yellow perch, I should have thought about that earlier, but I didn't. So now now should we do it now? And I don't think I'm going to be real hopeful for that until I know we get some bass numbers down. When we get some bass numbers down, then I think then we need to look at yellow perch. Another thing about that, part of my thought process about yellow perch is now we're adding another fish. It's basically a predator fish, and what's it going to eat and how's it going to compete? So not only can we establish them, how are we going to feed them? Maybe we could buy some that are feed trained. I don't know, but there's those dynamics with the way my brain works. Early on, I didn't think about adding them because I looked at them more as a predator as I did than a source of forage. But now they may be. But I'd like to be sure that there's some survival because they're expensive.
Let me throw another predator in there for you for a second. Since we're talking about trying to keep the bass numbers down, have we thought about muskie, northern pike, as something that would eat big fish?
Yeah. Actually, I've thought about tiger muskies, and I like that idea. And I think this next fall, I'm going to talk to Greg about that. We don't have to stock them very heavy, Get some little 13, 14-inch hammer-handled tiger muskies because they'll get to be 35 inches long, and those would be huge fun out there. In the lake, the stage is now set where tiger muskies could do pretty well.
Well, Wes, assuming I can get Deanna and my 2 daughters to listen to this podcast when it comes out, please explain to them why tiger muskies in the lake is not dangerous to their children.
Well, there was that one incident. I'm just kidding. That never happened.
That helps.
Because they are big and they are mean looking.
Yeah, they're big. They look like barracuda, but they're not going to attack your feet. They're gonna stay out away from people. They're going to avoid you, and they're just another predator out there that's looking for a fish meal. They're not going to be any issue for swimming or any. People swim in lakes all the time that have muskie and northern pike in them, and never heard of one attacking a person. If they won't be a problem, but they do eat very large meals. Muskie in general, Bob said they can get 35 inches in the lake. I just visited a small lake up in Illinois, and the lake record there was a 49 and a half incher. That was a tiger muskie. So that's a big fish with a big mouth full of teeth that's capable of taking down a 12-inch bass with no problem. So, and they're not going to be picking off 2-inch bluegill. They're going to be targeting larger mouth-sized meals and eating one big meal as opposed to lots of little meals, and that's going to help reduce the larger predators in the lake.
And they have a hard time swallowing a 35-pound grandchild too, by the way. So Deanna, tiger muskies could be pretty fun because actually the way I've seen it, I've got several lakes under management where we've used them, and one of them was actually not too far from your property near Calhoun, Missouri, a bunch of gravel pits. And I think we shocked up a 42-inch tiger muskie in that body of water. The reason I'm saying 35 inches is I'm pretty confident they'll do that. Then there's another lake over just a little bit west of St. Louis where we stocked a bunch of 13 and 14 inchers in there 3 years ago, and now they're catching some that are 27 to 28 inches. But we're not, when we're talking about, 3 per acre at the most, and when you think about 3 fish in an area the size of a football field, that's just not that many. No, they're strict ambush predators. So they like to linger near edge cover and then, eat a big meal and eat it fast. So a 25-inch, 28-inch tiger muskie will eat a 10 to 12-inch bass. I think they could be a really good part of the culling puzzle. So we are going to talk about that. I think it's a good time to do that.
We've talked about the largemouth and we've talked about the walleye. The smallmouth, they seem to grow okay. I caught one when I was up there before daylight, before sunrise, and we didn't see a whole lot of electrofishing. There's not many of them, but the ones that we saw seem to be healthy enough. Are you thinking about stocking more once we get the bass numbers down?
Yes. When we're talking about smallmouth bass, I didn't expect them to reproduce. I hope they would, but I didn't expect them to. So in order to jumpstart those again, we're going to need to stock some more, but I'm not comfortable recommending that until we get the largemouth bass numbers down some. We're working on a game plan for that. Like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be working with Bass Pro Shops, and even Johnny Morris knows about this lake. I had a conversation with him 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I told him about it, and he'd like to come up and man the electrofishing boat and help with it and have some fun with it. But working with Bass Pro Shops and then one of the smaller universities in Missouri that's got a fisheries program, I think we can do some pretty good managing the bass numbers. And once we get the largemouth bass numbers down, then I'm more comfortable stocking in some more smallmouth bass because you want to give them a chance,
Have you thought about feed trained smallmouth bass at all?
No, you got it.
I just was up at a place in outside of Chicago, private foundation, Max McGraw Wildlife Foundation, and they've got an aquaculture program where they're stocking out their lakes, and they have feed trained smallmouth bass in their hatchery. They actually have an aquaponics system where they've got smallmouth bass in the tanks, and the smallmouth are fed pellets, and the effluent grows lettuce for the facility. So I know it's possible.
Yeah, I've actually had some before. There's a hatchery in northeastern Oklahoma, and I haven't talked to them in 2 or 3 years. Last time I talked to them, all their fish were spoken for. All the fish they produced were committed. So I haven't talked to them in a while. Then there was another group in southwestern Missouri that did raise some, it was kind of a regenerative farmer who grew some smallmouth bass on pellets. And I'd completely forgotten about him. I'll see if I can find him and talk to him.
And Wes, would be the same kind of pellets that I feed the bluegills and sunfish with?
Yeah, absolutely. And largemouth bass are available like that too, but I don't think you need any more bass.
No. And that, for a lake that size, my experience with feed-trained largemouth bass suggests you got to have 20 to 25 pounds per acre of feed-trained bass for them to stay on the feed. Because I've stocked lakes like that with lower numbers and they don't come to the feed. So unless you get enough numbers of those, that's why I didn't recommend that in the first place. Plus, I wasn't confident of the genetic strains of feed-trained largemouth bass. I wanted to at least have something that had an opportunity to get big. And the biggest feed-trained bass I've ever seen was topped out at 8 pounds. And I've seen a lot of those, and that's it. That's what they do. The smallmouth bass, if you can grow some 8-pound smallmouth bass on feed, yay. I'm glad you suggested that. I'll do a little digging. I haven't thought about that.
2 or 3 years ago, we caught smallmouth all the time. The biggest one was 3.5 pounds. So that was a pretty darn good smallmouth bass.
Mm-hmm.
Now, about the only time I can consistently catch smallmouth is to just do it before the largemouth wake up. So early in the spring, like right now, I can go out and catch smallmouth bass when the largemouth aren't really interested yet.
We've mentioned most of the species in the lake. The bluegill aren't massive; they're good bluegill. But what we got on really heavily when we were there in October were very large red ear sunfish. They're doing quite well in the lake. I guess it's a clear lake. It's got a lot of vegetation. That's what red ear love. They're snail eaters, so they're looking for snails, and snails do really well when the water's clear and there's lots of vegetation for them to scrape paraphyton off of. We really got on some big red ears and numbers of red ears. So your red ear fishery is doing quite well.
Yes, it is. And the bluegill, he's got some bluegill that are knocking on the door of 1.25 pounds. And now I guess they're probably 4 years old. And another thing to keep in mind, Greg's feeding program is more of a supplemental program than one that's designed to really grow a whole bunch of giant fish. And so it's more to enhance the fisheries. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you what's happening with the feeding program. This viewers and listeners would be really interested in this. The benefit of feeding a high protein fish food like Purina's Aquamax MVP, for example, that's a feed that's going to enhance the fish's ability to reproduce. And we've documented 4 age 0 size classes in that lake. So that means the bluegill in that lake a couple of times I know of have spawned 4 times. That's a lot for that part of the planet. You'd expect 2 spawns and maybe in a good year 3 spawns. And I think that 4th spawn can be attributed to Punxsutawney Phil being right about spring being over, winter being over early, or that very last late fall spawn. So I think feeding the fish makes a big difference when it comes to helping reproduce. But I know that there's some of those feed hogs, feed trough bluegills that are going to be knocking on the door of 1.5 pounds by now.
Yeah, for that part of the world, that is good. So we've talked about all the prey. We've also mentioned the possibility of introducing more prey. So we've talked about golden shiners. Are you thinking about stocking shiners again here in the near future?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I'm going to recommend that to him. I'm taking all the data we collected last fall. I've summarized it. I've gotten everybody's ideas, of the group, our symposium, everybody that was there. I've gotten all those collected, and I've got all those in a file folder, and I just got to put them together and send them to him because now it's about time to have an action plan. So I think stocking some golden shiners is going to be a good idea. I like the tiger muskie idea. I'll explore smallmouth bass sources, see what we've got there, and start working out, see what we can do to start some harvesting. And I think what we're going to do with Dan Hoy and his group, I've got to pitch this to him again because he was all in, is maybe make 3 or 4 electrofishing trips over there, scattered out through the course of the year, and see if we can't be culling some of those bass and help that lake. And then put those fish to a good cause somewhere, to the cause of science and education and in a deep fryer with cornmeal.
Hey, Bob, from an uneducated point of view, does it matter where we put those shiners into the lake?
No, actually, I think it's smart to put them all in the same place because I think that enhances your survival rates. I've put them in. I'll tell you what, I've stocked them in a lake in North Carolina one time where we had several boats, and we had 2 barges and 2 fishing boats, and we put those fish in buckets and in portable transport tanks, moved them all around the lake, and I am thoroughly convinced they were gone within a few hours. Whereas if we turn them all loose in one area, there's only those predators locally there, and then the fish we stock get a little chance to get oriented so they can start getting their wits about them and start moving around a little bit and help increase their odds of survival. We'd like to have survival, because
Right.
We'd like to have some spawn, and we'd like them to live long enough that there's something other than a Tootsie Roll Pop in a grandchild's hand.
Yeah. Wes, one of the things nice about building a lake from scratch is you can build stuff beforehand. And we built a real nice boat ramp well deep into the water in a deeper area of the lake. And so all of our fish have gone into the same spot, and our survival rates, at least immediate survival rates, have been 99% plus. I just would like to see some get started down at the beginning of the tributaries. You know what I mean, Bob? And
Yeah.
that's a half a mile from where we put them in.
Well, we can certainly go put some up there. We'd have to do it from a boat, I think, because you
Yeah.
can't get a truck up there, you know.
Well, one more species we haven't really talked about. Normally you guys, clupeids are great prey for bass, and you're probably a little too far north for threadfin shad. And gizzard shad, Bob, if you're like me, you don't like to put gizzard shad in a lake until you start getting bass big enough to eat the big shad, which is usually 6 to 8 pounds. Well, we've got 6 to 8 pound fish now. Is gizzard shad something we should think about as a potential prey species in this lake?
Yes, for this lake. Yeah, it is. I'm right on the cusp of saying, yeah, let's pull the trigger on some gizzard shad. I would like to see a little bit more electrofishing data, although I know what it is. But what I'm saying is, I'd like to get I'd like to get some fish cold, and then I'd be real comfortable putting a few gizzard shad in.
And one of the reasons why you'd want to cold fish first is because just introducing any new prey species, it's really hard to get them established when there's that gauntlet of mouths that they have to get by.
That's right. And for viewers with other kinds of lakes, I'm going to say this. I don't have a single trophy bass managed lake that doesn't have gizzard shad. Every trophy bass lake I've ever managed, I've wanted to have gizzard shad in there. But here's my criteria. I want to see at least 25% of the mass 3 pounds and bigger. So we're probably there with this lake, but at the same time, you got to stock them with some expectations that you're going to have survival rates.
We're probably just there, though, Bob. We're probably just there. Yeah.
If we can harvest the 20 pounds of small bass per acre, you'll be there for sure.
Absolutely. Yep. And even if we could knock it down by, even if we could harvest 500 pounds of those intermediate sized bass, I'd be pretty comfortable with gizzard shad.
And one thing, we mentioned the golden shiners and just putting in lollipops that get eaten up right away. The reason why that's not a good thing is because the energy transfer, only about 10% of that goes to new bass growth. So if you think, let's say we stock 10,000 pounds of golden shiners into the lake without reproduction, that's only going to make 1,000 pounds of bass. Spread that out on a 65-acre lake. That's maybe 13, 14 pounds per acre, split between 100 bass. it becomes almost indetectable at that point in time.
Yeah, just a snack.
And you spent $100,000 to buy 10,000
Yes,
pounds
exactly.
of shiner.
So it's you need reproduction. You need natural production of prey in the lake.
That's right.
To be able to have a cost-effective way to grow fish.
That's right. So the original goal was to have the lake to where we could at least juggle the balance, and for the first 2 or 3 years, we were in good shape. And then it's just exactly like every other lake, now it's top heavy with the predators, and there's no sense stocking a whole lot of forage fish if you're not managing the predator numbers, which we knew this was going to happen. We've seen it coming. Now we're establishing the best game plan to be able to deal with it. Like Greg says, how many landowners, from the landowner perspective, is 1,300 pounds of bass a year? I don't think so.
I like to tell people that the way to trophy fish is through their stomach. And there's 2 ways you can get at that. One is by increasing prey, but the other way is by decreasing predators, right? So you need to do both. Your lake, for example, maybe it can support 50 pounds of bass per acre or 50 pounds of predators per acre, let's say. Well, that could be 5, 10-pound largemouth bass, or that could be 51-pound largemouth bass, but it's only going to support 50 pounds per acre. By reducing numbers, you put more prey energy available for the fish to remain. And that's the goal. The goal is to get, you want them to have an unlimited food supply.
And and one of the tipping points that's hard to hit, but I've got some lakes under management where we've hit it, is where you actually have enough of those bigger predators that they're making a significant difference by culling some of those fish that we don't have to physically go cull. So one of the goals of stocking that many largemouth bass was having that many largemouth bass big enough that now they can eat a lot of these younger bass. The little catch-22 here was not enough of them got big enough fast enough to start helping right now. But one of my hopes is that we can cull some of these younger bass as these average to above average to excellent growth rate bass get to that tipping point where they can help cull a whole bunch of fish too. And tiger muskies could help hit that tipping point as well. I'd love that lake to get to the point where there is zero bass free production.
Do you have a source of all female bass?
Yeah, you just pay twice as much.
For future lakes, could you start off with a low density stocking of all female fish, followed by a high density stocking of largemouth bass a year later, so that you get that size range distribution where you get the big fish out there capable of culling off the smaller fish?
Yeah, you can do that. I've done that before. And here's the thing is those bass have to be 6 to 8 inches long before you can really sex them. Well, on a fish farm, a 6 to 8 inch bass is a year old. When the word trophy bass comes out of a guy's mouth, what that means to me is now I got to kind of do the balancing act. Do I buy some fish that have lost a significant amount of growth in their first year because they've been confined at a hatchery? Or should we stock those small fish that I know are going to be 13 or 14 inches by the fall and within just a few months, and then start culling? So that was, for this lake, was a pretty easy decision to make to me.
Well, guys, is there anything else we want to cover before we start wrapping it up?
Well, you know what? It would be really interesting for folks to hear more of the landowner's perspective. So like one thing I would ask Greg is, you were looking at this with eyes wide open, and there's things that are happening like you thought they would, and there's some things that aren't happening like you thought they would. So from your perspective, the pond owner, the lake owner, kind of take us through just a little progression of what you thought and what you think, and now where are you now with your thought process?
One of the best days of my life was when the Corps of Engineers brought the EPA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Missouri Department of Conservation, and the Missouri Department of Natural Resources all to the site of the future Lake Deanna so they could review the project and see if they felt my lake was in the best interest of the overall environment. And I was so thrilled when the folks from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Missouri Department of Conservation all came out strongly in favor of this lake being allowed to be built. And of course, we got our Corps permit, and life has been fantastic ever since. Since then, we've also done a 100-acre restoration project here with the Missouri Department of Conservation, where we took out cattle grass and brought in native species of warm season grass. And I'll never forget asking the Department of Conservation, when do we need to try to introduce some of the more native species? And he looked at me and just said, they'll come. You don't have to do anything. Now our lake is the site of multiple great blue herons. We have a pair of unbelievably beautiful bald eagles who live here at Lake Deanna. I wish they'd eat more largemouth bass, but they certainly, I've seen them eat some. We have owls and red-tailed hawks and other hawks. We have giant and small turtles. We have created an ecosystem here that I think really benefits nature. And it's great to create something where your grandkids can ski and where they can fish. And obviously, I love all those things. But we've also done something that's the right thing to do, not just the best thing.
And I remember when I was there, you pointed to some trees on the bank, and some dead trees, and said, I'm not taking those out because that's habitat.
I remember Bob telling me we're going to leave some trees right near the coast, right near the edge of the water, and we'll see if they survive or not. And so we have 8 or 10 trees along the edge of the lake that are large former oaks, and all of them are just sitting there dead. And it was between Bob and the Department of Conservation folks who reminded me over and over again, do not touch those trees. Do not touch those trees. Woodpeckers, owls, hawks, all sorts of species will depend on those, bats. But what really hit me was when I was told, maybe even a bald eagle. Well, the very first summer, we became the home to a breeding pair of bald eagles who now live here. We see them every day. We often see both. We see them swoop down on the water, and I just don't think there's anything so magical as that.
Well, I can't think of a better place to end this podcast than right there, gentlemen. Thank you guys both so much for being on here. I think the listeners will have enjoyed hearing about the development and progress with Lake Deanna. I think we also may have come up with sort of a game plan for the lake moving forward, some good ideas. And, so both Bob, thanks for being on here for the second time. And Greg, thanks for coming on here and telling us about your lake.
You're both welcome back here anytime. Take care, guys.
Appreciate it. See you guys.
Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.